Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week I'm going to continue trying to get back into some comic book series that I've been neglecting for some time with Supreme number 3. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in June of 1993, we can see that this issue of Supreme features another Extreme Studios creation, that being the superhero team of Bloodstrike. Though for the life of me, I can't really figure out why Bloodstrike is featured in this issue, and I think you'll understand what I mean once we get inside. Creator, co-plotter, Rob Liefeld. Pencils, co-plotter. Script, colors, Brian Murray. Inks, Chris Ivey. Lettering, Kurt Hathaway. Editor, Eric Stevenson. Color separations, Chameleon Prime. The story starts out with Mr. Temple giving a backstory presentation about Supreme to the rest of the heavy metal team. This is important because Supreme is brand new to their team, and most of the heavy metal members were not alive, or at the very least not on Earth, the last time that Supreme was around. Temple goes on to explain that Supreme was instrumental in the Allies' defeat of the Nazis during World War II, as we see black and white footage of Supreme holding 2 bombs as he flies over a battlefield. He then goes on to say that Supreme was essentially one of the most determining factors in the Allied victory over the Nazi Party, explaining that the Nazis had no superpowered beings of their own and therefore were not able to withstand any of Supreme's assaults. He's interrupted by Menagerie, who tells him that this is kind of boring and that he wants him to hurry things up, but Temple just tells him to pipe down. However, Menagerie, who is taking the form of Crow T. Robot from Mystery Science Theater 3000, goes on to make a joke saying, "Come on, Servo, where are you at when I need you, buddy?" Meanwhile, Supreme is in outer space, towing a large spacecraft covered in satellite dishes for reasons we have no idea about. He is being observed by Admiral Kirk, spelled K''HRK. This, of course, being a reference to Captain Kirk in Star Trek, but not spelled the same way for obvious copyright infringement violation reasons. As I never know exactly how to say this, Catalan Space Armada is at the edge of the solar system observing Supreme, taking a great interest in his return to his home planet. They watch Supreme as he, for unknown reasons, tows this vessel we've never seen before in the Supreme comic itself through space to a location that's not really explained either. We then get a close-up of Supreme in a 2-page top splash towing this unknown vessel through space for seemingly no reason. And I say that because while maybe this does tie into some story point that happens in another Extreme Studios book, it definitely doesn't tie into any of the story points that occurred in the first 2 issues of Supreme. So if you were only reading this title and this happened to play into something that happened in another title, you're completely lost, as I am right now, as to why Supreme is doing any of this. Meanwhile, back on Earth, we see that the team is continuing their briefing from Mr. Temple. Menagerie turns into his base form and asks for a Danish from Riot, who tells him to shut up and passes him the Danish. We then see Temple go on to explain to the team that Hitler's ultimate undoing was his own hubris. He believed that his master race was unstoppable and that no army in the world could ever match up against them. However, at this point, Decibel interjects and tells Temple yes, but Hitler was also a madman who was completely out of touch with reality, and that was honestly going to probably lead to his undoing no matter what, despite Supreme being involved. Temple agrees with this point, telling Decibel that while the Allies most certainly would have emerged victorious from World War II, that Supreme's involvement definitely sped things along, and that Supreme basically won World War II single-handedly by himself. Now, there's only one problem with this. This completely undermines the narrative that we saw in Youngblood Strike File issues 1 through 3, where we saw that Die Hard, Super Patriot, and Glory were also very heavily involved in fighting against the Nazis with the Allied powers. And Temple doesn't mention this in any way. Also, Supreme isn't really mentioned in any of those issues as being a major contributing factor in ending the war either. And this would be forgivable if it weren't for the fact that both of these stories are happening within the Extreme universe. And at some point, someone should have said, hey, wait a second, these stories aren't gelling at all. I find it really odd that Rob Liefeld wasn't paying a little bit closer attention to make sure that these stories were lining up. I'd be a little bit more forgiving of it if this wasn't lining up with a story that happened in a Wildstorm book or one of Mark Silvestri's titles or Spawn or something like that, because you're dealing with completely different creators and completely different studios. But this is all in-house with Extreme, so it seems really ridiculous that none of this matches up. And if you don't believe me, feel free to check out my Youngblood Strike File playlist, where you can find the first 3 issues of Youngblood Strike File that go into depth on explaining the backstory of Super Patriot, Die Hard, and to some extent Glory as well. We then see as the Catellans continue to monitor Supreme as he finishes up with whatever it is he was doing with this spacecraft, that they have determined he has once again decided to make his home amongst the Terrans back on Earth. As Temple concludes his presentation, he hits the lights and asks Decibel to hang back with him so that they can go over the list of delegates arriving in Washington, D.C. for the Pacific Coexistence Summit. He then dismisses the rest of the team, but as they're walking out, he hands a card to Riot. This card is of his personal tailor, as he tells Riot that the PR department has determined his costume is a little bit too 70s-ish. Riot does not take kindly to this, as he actually starts to give a little bit of lip to Temple for critiquing his outfit, but at this point he is interrupted by Menagerie, who asks if he can tag along. As Riot, Menagerie, and Skyraker exit the boardroom, Menagerie does his best to try and smooth things over, as he tells Riot that Temple's really not so bad once you get to know him, and that he honestly believes that he's the best of all the base commanders. Riot shrugs his shoulders and says, well, at least you like him, as Menagerie leans over and tries to get Skyraker's attention, who is walking away. He tells Skyraker that he should tag along with them to the tailor as well, because perhaps he can get a fresh coat of armorall. However, Skyraker completely ignores Menagerie's joke as he steps onto an elevator and heads towards the roof. Menagerie then tells Riot that at some point they're going to have to teach Skyraker to get a clue, as he asks Riot why he continues to work for Gate if he dislikes Temple so much. Riot then tells Menagerie that he was made an offer he couldn't refuse, and that his agreement with Gate allows him to take care of a lot of the problems back in his old neighborhood. We then see a depiction of Riot as he oversees the offloading of a truck filled with large boxes, which implies that perhaps Riot comes from an impoverished and underserved community, and that he uses his position at Gate to get much-needed supplies and funding and charity to his community to try and elevate them. He then asks Menagerie, yeah, so what's your story? What does Temple have on you? And we then learn a very interesting piece of information as Menagerie tells Riot, well, he created me. We then see Skyraker finally get towards the roof and use a communicator on his chest to contact his ship, which is named Dionicus, I believe is the way you're supposed to say that, and ask to be beamed aboard. The ship immediately uses some sort of teleportation or beaming technology to bring Skyraker directly to itself, as we find out that his ship/pet, as it's described, hovers consistently above Washington, D.C. at around a altitude of 35 kilometers is how it's put here. Now, the ship being described as also having some sort of biological component or sentient component, as it is said to be his pet, would definitely reinforce the idea that everything on the planet that Skyraker is from has some sort of biological component to it. This, of course, is something we discovered in issue number 2, when Supreme tried to scan Skyraker's body and found that the biological makeup that builds Skyraker's body is shared also with his weaponry, implying that his weapons are also alive the same way that he is. So it now stands to reason that essentially everything on the planet he comes from may share this quality, which would imply that the ship itself is alive as well. We then see an advertisement for Prophet. Now, I have not reached the point in the Youngblood story where Prophet breaks off into his own solo series as of recording this video. However, rest assured, once I do, I will begin making videos about Prophet, as I have a pretty decent amount of the Prophet series. And he's also a character I've always found to be very interesting. I really liked the Prophet story, despite the fact that it does get kind of confusing at some point. But overall, I think it's an interesting story, and he's an interesting character. And I look forward to making those videos in the future. Getting back to the story, as Skyraker is beamed aboard his ship, he is immediately given a briefing about certain things that are going on, which don't seem to necessarily be common knowledge to the rest of the heavy metal team. Notably, the ship gives us our first insight as to exactly what Supreme was doing at the beginning of this book, as it tells Skyraker that Supreme has established a heavily shielded complex computer outside of the Earth's orbit. The only problem is that's not really much of an explanation. We still don't know really anything that's going on as it relates to what Supreme was doing in the beginning of this book. This is a complex computer array, apparently, that's the size of a spacecraft. And where did it come from? Who knows? Who made it? We have no idea. Why on earth does Supreme need it? Your guess is as good as mine. We don't know how he secured this thing. Did he steal it? Was it given to him? Did he buy it somehow? What exactly is going on, and why is it happening? These are things that we don't learn in this book, and I have no idea exactly what any of that was about, so hopefully it'll get explained in future issues. The ship then goes on to give Skyraker an update about the Catalan battle cruisers that had been tracking Lieutenant Combat, of course Combat being the member of Youngblood who hails from an alien world. His people are the ones that are also tracking Supreme, as they want to more fully understand exactly why he's returned to Earth. Skyraker then goes on to tell the ship that the Catalans are definitely tracking Supreme, and it's because of his presence that they are now approaching the Earth. He then tells the ship to access the, hold on, I gotta read this because this is some gibberish if I've ever seen it, Ankoi Cased Galactel, whatever the heck that's supposed to be, and use it to cross-reference both the Acacian and Catalan data regarding Supreme during the past 25 annum. Cool. Comic book science gibberish. The ship says that doing this will require about 25 hours of time. However, Skyraker is not going to accept this, as he tells the ship to divert power from the warp engines and that he expects this information to be back to him in the next 12 hours, and that he will eagerly await this information planet-side. We are then teleported to Dulles International Airport in Washington, D.C. This is because many of the foreign delegates who are involved in the Pacific Coexistence Summit are arriving at the airport. However, the security in the airport seems rather abnormally high. Even though there are so many foreign delegates arriving, the level of security personnel seems to be 3 or 4 times the norm, which many of the delegates, as well as other airport goers, seem to be rather confused by. Meanwhile, we are then reunited with Riot and Menagerie, as Riot is getting the final fittings for his new costume as per Mr. Temple's orders. However, Riot is none too impressed when he sees himself in the mirror, as he states he looks like a damned Youngblood. However, the tailor states that if he knows Mr. Temple, Temple will in fact be rather pleased with the outcome. However, at this moment, this meeting is interrupted when Riot gets a sudden communication from Temple himself, who tells him that there is a hostage situation at the Dulles International Airport and that an unknown terrorist group has taken hostage all of the foreign delegates as well as the rest of the airport terminal inhabitants. We then get an advertisement for Deathmate Red. Now, I've stated in the past multiple times that I do have all of Deathmate and I will eventually make a series of videos about it. However, it's not high on my list of priorities and it's not something that I'm itching to get into anytime soon, so I wouldn't hold my breath. We then get back into the story and see that Temple orders Riot and Menagerie to join up with Supreme, Decibel, and Skyraker at Dulles International Airport, and that the government's Blood Strike unit is already there and that he wants the team to act accordingly. As an aside, he then tells Riot that he really likes the new costume. We then see that members of Bloodstrike have already established a perimeter as they hold back the press, not to the enjoyment of the local PD, who state, what are these costume nutjobs going to do that we can't? We then see that Foreplay is doing her best to make sure that none of the press corps gets through. However, Tag tells her, why not let them in, see how well they do once the lead starts to fly. Many of the press have a lot of questions, wondering if everyone inside is safe and if the hostages have been killed or if any of the delegates have found harm coming to them. And it's at this point that we see the heavy metal team descend upon Dulles International Airport to lend a hand. As soon as the heavy metal team lands, they are informed by none other than Deadlock himself that their presence is unwelcome. He tells them that he doesn't know who they are or why they're here, but that it doesn't matter because this is a blood strike operation and they have the situation well under control. However, Supreme doesn't necessarily buy this as he asks Deadlock, so what's your plan then? Deadlock, however, remains defiant as he raises a pistol in Supreme's direction and tells him to sit down, shut up, and watch the pros work. Realizing that she doesn't need this situation to get any more out of control than it already is, Foreplay decides to intervene as she tells Deadlock to back down and then decides that she's going to brief the heavy metal team on exactly what the situation at hand is. Everyone then moves to some other location that's not really explained but happens to have a holographic schematic of the airport for some reason. And she then goes on to tell them exactly what's going on. She explains that the terrorists disguised themselves as increased security, which is how they were able to infiltrate the airport in the first place, and that there's roughly about 200 of them, and that they've taken 40 delegates and 400 other airport travelers hostage, and that the Bloodstrike team was planning on trying to use some sort of a nerve gas to make everyone unconscious, giving them the ability to get everyone out safely. But due to the sudden arrival of heavy metal, the terrorists have gotten antsy, and she's afraid that they've already started to execute some of the hostages. Upon hearing this, Riot states that with his speed, he could easily infiltrate the airport and deploy all of this nerve gas that the Bloodstrike team wanted to use and be out before anyone even noticed he was there. He's then backed up by Menagerie, who says, yeah, Riot's your man for the job. Also, I don't know why Menagerie is in this goat man form for seemingly no reason. I mean, they're not actively engaged in combat at this point, so there's really no reason for him to take on a super form for really any reason at all. He should probably be in his default form for this briefing, but I guess they just thought it would be cooler to draw him as this ram person for some reason. However, Cabot immediately shoots down Riot's plan as he states that if the hostages are indeed already being killed by the terrorists, that means they've run out of time and they need to go for broke, infiltrate the airport, and pick up whatever pieces are left. Skyraker tries to argue that this will result in all of the hostages being killed, but Cabot once again states that they're already being killed, which means time is up. However, before he can continue his argument, he happens to look over and notice that Supreme is walking towards the terminal as he asks, where does that guy think he's going? Inside of the airport terminal, the hostages immediately notice Supreme making his entrance and open fire. However, Supreme's nearly impervious body is unaffected by the hailstorm of bullets impacting it as he continues to move towards the terrorists. The terrorists immediately realize the grave mistake they've made. However, Supreme gives them no opportunity to surrender. He instead begins to mow through them with absolutely no remorse or consideration for even trying to take any of them alive. He leaves in his wake a sea of carnage and violence unlike anything these men have ever witnessed, as we see Supreme depicted in a way that we would later see, well, more than a decade later see, with characters like Omni-Man and Homelander, with a character who has powers the likes of which Superman wields, but who uses methods more akin to what we would see from the Punisher. Meanwhile, one of the other terrorists nearby hears all of the screaming and gunfire and decides that the plan has gone awry, and if the airport is being infiltrated, he's going to take down as many of the hostages as he can before he's captured, as he opens fire upon all of the innocents. However, this is when Supreme shows up, grabs the man from behind, snaps his gun barrel in half, and then uses his laser vision to beam lasers directly into the terrorist's eyeballs and melt his brain from the inside. Pretty hardcore way to take somebody out. Also, I'd like to point out that I really like the way that this full-page splash is actually divided into two panels by the barrel of the terrorist rifle. That's a really cool way of drawing this, and I really appreciate the creativeness behind doing it like this. We then get an advertisement for Brigade number 0. If you'd like to know more about Brigade, you can check out my Brigade playlist. And as I finally secured the last issue of the Brigade miniseries that I needed to finish that up and get into the ongoing series, I've recently started making Brigade videos once again, so that playlist is going to be expanding. Stay tuned for more. We then get a close-up of the terrorist's head as it continues to be incinerated from the inside out. Brutal way to die. And then see the combined teams of Heavy Metal and Bloodstrike racing inside of the airport as Cabot says, "What in the hell is Supreme doing?" As the two teams finally arrive to the grisly scene, they are greeted by the image of Supreme holding the lifeless body of the terrorist whose brain he just melted. Shocked by what he's seeing, Riot asks Supreme, "How could you do this?" However, Cabot immediately tells Riot to grow up, and then states that this is what needed to be done from the very beginning, and that he's only surprised that Supreme actually had the guts to do it. Cabot then asks who wants to volunteer to go and explain all of this to the media, as Riot asks him, "How could you even be thinking about the media right now when these men need medical attention?" However, in all of the commotion and confusion, no one seems to notice that Supreme looks upward towards the sky with his eyes aglow. He then jumps up into the air and blasts his way out through the roof of the airport and suddenly just leaves the scene of all of this carnage as everyone else is left to wonder what exactly is going on. We then see a shadowy figure from behind who states, "You hear me out here, don't you, Supreme? Well then come to me once again," as we see Supreme angrily flying through the solar system towards a spacecraft that sits lonely out in the middle of the darkest regions of the edge of our solar system. And being that this is an Extreme Studios title, it means we have to have at least one 2-page vertical splash, because why wouldn't we? As the being states, "Race towards your final destiny, Supreme, your death at the hands of Chrome," as we see that this is to be continued in the next issue. I mean, okay, fine. This character's new. He's apparently some major threat to Supreme, but given how easily Supreme has been able to deal with basically everyone else that he's faced up until this point, there better be something super unique and special about this Chrome character if he's to provide any type of challenge whatsoever to Supreme. We then get an advertisement for Dooms 4. I unfortunately have only a few issues of Dooms 4, but once I get more issues of this book, I'll start making videos about it, so stay tuned for that. And an advertisement for Youngblood Strike File number 2, which only reinforces the criticisms I made earlier in this book about Temple making the statement that Supreme single-handedly won World War II for the Allies. As I stated, Youngblood Strike-File clearly states that Die Hard, Super Patriot, and Glory were instrumental in fighting the Nazis during World War II. And for this book not to even acknowledge them being involved in it makes no sense. Also, Youngblood Strike-File at no point acknowledges that Supreme was involved in any way. So again, this is really just kind of a huge miscue on the part of the people in charge at Extreme Studios, not realizing that they had two separate stories dealing with a very important piece of characters' history and not intertwining those stories in any way, or at least acknowledging the fact that the other characters were involved in some way, shape, or form. It's just kind of, amateurish that the people in charge didn't stop these writers and say, hey, wait a second, you need to make these stories work together, because otherwise it seems really confusing that neither of these two stories are acknowledging each other in any way, shape, or form. We then get a 2-page ad for Extreme 64-page quarterly featuring the talents of people like Rob Liefeld, Danny Miki, Dan Frega, and a whole host of others. I unfortunately do not have this, though if I ever come across it, I will absolutely buy it and make a video about it. On the final page of the book, we get an advertisement for Trencher. I have the first 5 issues of Trencher, I believe, and I probably should start making videos about him. Trencher was a very unique comic book, to say the least, and it is something that I would like to talk about in the future. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for Spawn number 15. If you'd like to know more about Spawn number 15 and Spawn in general, you can check it out in my Spawn playlist. And that was Supreme number 3. And I find this book confusing, to say the least. Obviously, there's the whole World War II problem that I've pointed out already, but there's other things going on as well. That whole sequence with the supercomputer thing that's floating around in outer space that Supreme just brings in from nowhere with absolutely no explanation, that doesn't make sense. And also, why is Bloodstrike involved in this in any way? They did literally nothing the entire time they were in this book. Every single page that any member of Bloodstrike is on features them standing and talking. They in no way aided in getting the terrorist situation under control. And honestly, this story could have been exactly the same with or without their involvement. So I really don't understand what the reasoning behind bringing them into this issue was in the first place. But then again, these are just my opinions. You may not have had a problem with the supercomputer in outer space that has no explanation, the complete lack of cohesion between this and the Youngblood Strike-File storyline, and you might have really appreciated Bloodstrike being involved in this issue despite them just kind of standing around and doing nothing. And if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinion. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.